An education developer here at Blick Art Materials, and I'm really excited to show you how to paint a conch shell in watercolor. We're going to be using the Utrecht Artists Acrylic paints on a 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. We're going to use the Blick Masterstroke watercolor brushes to mop on a wash and create texture and build layer upon layer to replicate the subtle and natural textures that you find in a conch shell. So you can find a free printable reference image that we're going to be painting from today on our bundle page. Go check it out. You'll find all the materials that we're using here today so that you can get started on your own seashell watercolor. So I'm excited to dive right in, and the first thing that you're going to want to do is make a quick sketch on your paper, and you're also going to want to tape it down on your work surface. I love using a 1/2-inch foam core board for a makeshift watercolor surface to paint on, and tacking that down with a low tack artist's tape or watercolor tape. So that's what we've done here. If you don't have a board, you can use a watercolor board, or like I said, just tape it down onto your work surface. That way, as the water soaks into your paper, it'll prevent warping, and you're going to want to let it dry flat completely so that you can keep your paper nice and taut and flat when it's all dry and ready to frame. You can find the drawing on the bundle page to make this process even that much easier. And once you do, an easy transfer process to help you get started is to, once you have your paper tacked down, take your piece of graphite transfer paper and place that graphite side down, and then you're going to take your drawing and you're going to place it right side up, and then applying pressure, use a pencil to transfer that drawing right onto the paper. And what you will have is something that looks just like this. So once you have that started, you're going to want to pick the colors that match closely with your palette. And for our painting today, I think a very helpful tool. So for our painting today, I just don't want to forget to tell you about it because I do think it's very useful. Holding your paint color up to your reference image to be able to pull out the right colors is ideal, especially when you're using something like a set of watercolors. Maybe you received a gift from a friend, or you want a wide range of colors to choose from. Picking out those colors and holding them up against your reference image can help you to identify colors when you're dealing with something like a seashell that has a lot of whites, silvers, pewter colors, things like that, and pulling that out and helping to identify that color palette. So just a quick tip to help you get started out there. So let's go ahead and load up our watercolor palette with our colors, and we're just going to evenly space them enough with just enough color. We don't need a whole lot to get started because we are going to make a wash. So we have our permanent alizarin crimson, golden earth, and then we have our cooler colors, our cerulean blue. I'm going to put that down here because I don't want my colors to get muddy, and our Payne's gray. All right, now let's make a wash. A wash is made when you add water to your watercolor. I like to start with approximately a 1:10 ratio. We do want this to be nice and light because we are just going to build on that first layer. So we want our watercolors to be transparent. All right, and another trick, since we're on the topic of tips and tricks, is to have a piece of watercolor paper handy where you can test your washes for color intensity. So I have an extra watercolor block right here. I'm going to set that right there. Let's go ahead and mix up our colors. We have these nice mopping brushes. I've got a size 14 and a size 10 that we're going to use to get started. So I'm going to use the smaller one to mix up our color here. Don't want to cover that up too much. So get it really well incorporated with your water. And then bring it to your test paper and you can test that wash. So this is really intense color. I think we should dilute these down just a little bit more and then we'll be ready to get started. So I'm going to take my pipette and with clean water, add a little more. And I do like to have 2 containers of water, one for just clean water and one where I can clean my brushes. Okay, and then I'm going to bring this back and test the intensity again. I think that's probably where we want. And you can see very slightly a difference in intensity right there. Let's go ahead and mix these all around. Always have some paper towel handy or a painter's rag, whatever you prefer. All right. And if you want that color even lighter, I think it's good to have the right watercolor palette handy. So if you want to adjust the intensity of your wash, you can always add more water and take that into another palette, another well in your palette, that is. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare for that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I think we could work from the outside in with this process. And just to dip our toes in the sand, we're going to do a little bit of edging just to help bring this image forward as we get started. It's always important to look at your reference photo before you start painting. I notice this nice crisp golden earth edging around the object. So I think I'm going to try to capture that at the very beginning here. So if we take one of our smallest round brushes, and this is a size 4, very versatile size. Try and get my hand out of the way there. And start to pick up some of that edging where you see that crisp golden color. Very natural sandy color, so it really makes sense in our color palette. Maybe you're out there planning a trip to the beach, or maybe you're daydreaming about the beach. I know I am. And you're thinking of how to capture some of the essence of that sandy beach. And I think one of the ways to get there is through painting. And what better way to decorate your home or your office or something similar, baby's room, kid's room, with some of that beach inspiration, than to paint the same items that inspire us from the sea. There's lots of inspiration in the ocean. So we're going to try to capture that here. So a little bit of edging. It doesn't have to be a full outline. Nothing in nature is outlined with one single line, so why would we do that here? Going to keep it natural. And you can see that we've done a nice job of capturing a really light wash. Watercolor is going to dry a little bit lighter than when you applied it. So keep that in mind. We have these nice texture lines that we can go ahead and start to pull out some of the ribs of the conch shell. And it is a complex shape. It's not always easy to capture all of the curves, pointed textures, things like that. But we're going to do our best here. So now we've got this down, And we want to quickly cover some of these larger, more broad areas. And so we're going to use a technique that I like to refer to as mopping. Many other people like to refer to it that way too. It's just referring to the process of mopping your color onto your surface. And keeping our wash nice and light, I'm going to combine this cerulean blue color that we mixed earlier with this Payne's gray, and it's going to give me this kind of pewter silver color. We can go back to our test paper and you can see this really nice blue silver hue that we've created. So let's go with that and use that to fill in some of this information here. And we're mopping the color on, and you can use the motion of your hand to capture the motion of the seashell, or the direction that the seashell is grown in. Sometimes you can see the grain of the seashell, you can see how it's morphed, and you want to try to capture that in your work. And we can go edge to edge, and I'm okay with some of this wet into wet blending. I actually like that. I think a little bit of wet into wet blending is going to make this object look a little more natural. So we're liberally applying this color all the way around. I'm not being too precise. We're just covering large areas at once. Now let's go with that wet and wet technique in motion. Let's mix down a lighter wash of this permanent alizarin crimson, and let's keep mopping to these areas where that color starts to shine through, where the curve of the seashell starts to happen. And bring that in and let your colors flow. And this is just our underpainting. So if you're someone who really likes to capture a lot of detail, my best advice to you would be to prime your surface in this way to get a good layer of color down right at the beginning and let that dry. And when you do, that next layer of paint that you apply is going to be extra sticky because the watercolor paper likes a good layer of primer to work with. And it really helps your watercolors to adhere. You can go right over the color that you applied. Okay, now is a good opportunity to start really diving into the center focus of the seashell. Now we've already done some staining with our brush strokes here, and we're going to again lighten our wash with that golden earth hue, and we're going to mop that on. You could use a larger brush. You could certainly use the size 14. It really depends on your comfort level, what you prefer. You always want to choose the right brush for the area that you're painting, so the right size and shape is really going to depend on your subject matter. And also try not to, well, take it too seriously. I think getting caught up on the details too soon could be a mistake, especially with something like we talked about earlier, as complex as a seashell. I think we want to just capture the essence, capture the seashell vibe, if you will, and roll with that. And the nice thing about making a variety of washes that range from intense to less intense is that they will show up differently on your surface here. So you're going to see a nice change in intensity as we flow through this piece. Now, so we've done a lot of staining here, and I want to quickly show you a lifting technique. So let's say we want to lighten up some of these areas where we want it to be more white, and we don't want it to be quite as dark. Well, we've saved a dry round 14 brush that we can do a little bit of lifting with. So where it's still a bit wet, we can actually pick up the watercolor that we put down and we can lighten that area. You can wet the brush as well, deposit that excess watercolor onto your drying surface, apply a little bit of water, and you can see how we can easily lighten that area. And that's another way to get that variation from your wash. We can do that same thing here. Maybe we don't want it so streaky, so we can put that water back in and take it back out. But we can also come back. And just by doing that, we can create some highlights. And maybe you'll even surprise yourself through this process how some of that variety can really capture some of the natural features of the work. You can use this process to help define highlights like we are doing here. I think that suffices for now. Let's keep working on this layer, but let's add some more subtle details with a darker wash. I think as a rule, I think personally with painting, the best way to work is from light to dark. So let's try to capture some of these more subtle curves and edges with a darker wash. It's all about that color wash here today. And you can even darken up some of the edges just to give a little more variation. But then we can also pick it back up, and that's a really nice way to stain the paper and just add that subtle shading. Let's take this slightly more intense wash and let's capture some of the detail of the rocky edges on the tip here. And you can see how working light to dark can really help that detail to come forward. That's really part of what we're after. Pick up your edges with just a subtle outline following the drawing that you have or that you've sketched. Of course, you can always freehand, but as a rule of thumb, try to make your drawing nice and light. And that's because once that watercolor goes down, you won't be able to get the graphite back up. So if you tend to paint very light, keep your sketch nice and light. And we're going to just pick that up. Some of these edges. Now, let's make a little bit of texture and have a little bit of fun. Because everything in nature doesn't look like a perfect edge or a perfect curve. And this is the 12 flat. You can even pick some water up and do a combination of lifting and staining. And let's take our golden earth and pick up some of the rockiness. I want to make sure I'm sharing my image with you. We're making texture around the cone of the shell and with the ribs here. We've got this lovely rocky texture, and we're going to try to capture that. So we're just going to blot in a little bit of that rockiness where we see it. And I don't want it too intense, so I go back in with a dry brush and I pull that out even more. And you could have as much or as little texture as you like. It really depends on how you prefer to paint. Okay, let's go a little bit farther before we move on to our next step in the process after everything is dry. I'm going to take some of this lovely pewter color, and I think we want to mop a little bit of that in, and we're going to do a little staining and a little bit of lifting, and it's going to leave just enough rocky color. But we're also going to lift. So that's a fascinating idea, putting color down just to lift it back up so that you can even further change the color hues of the surface. And we're getting this really nice sandy color here. Okay, and now we've got a really nice base. Let's lift a little bit more. Like we talked about before, we want to see some of that highlight come through. And you'll see how that first layer, that stain layer, goes down, and it doesn't necessarily come back up. So that is slightly in contrast to what we talked about before, where we're working light to dark. With watercolor, you can stain the layers underneath and it'll show through. So a healthy balance of both of those techniques is really going to work well in this piece. All right, so this is a great start, but of course we're not done. We're going to continue to stain and lift and transform this conch shell as we continue to move through the piece and bring it in. And like we talked about before, your watercolor, is this in a good place? Your watercolor is going to dry lighter than when you applied it. So it's really important, that's another reason that we keep our paper tack down, it's really important to allow some layers to dry as you're working, because when you go back in, you're going to want everything to be totally dry to reduce bleeding and make sure that you can get that dry on wet technique started. Sorry, reverse that. That wet on dry technique. Wet and wet, dry on wet, wet on dry. Let's keep them all straight. So right now we're going to do the wet and dry technique here. And we're just going to continue with the same, almost the same exact process as we did before, but we're going to intensify the color. And that's going to help us bring this to a close. But we're going to have ever more detail than we did before. So let's go back and kind of pick up where we started and capture the rough-hewn golden edges that we noticed when we first started, but we're working layer over layer, so we can add even more detail as we're working here. So maybe you like to go and hang out at the beach and observe the seashells. I do want to say we don't want to collect too many seashells because our sea creatures use those seashells as homes. So I hope that you enjoy painting the seashells and not necessarily always plucking them out. But they are wonderful to observe, and they are so, so beautiful, which is why this is such a wonderful way to capture your memories from your vacation of visiting the beach. So we can continue to add this texture as we saw before. Not too much, but not too little. Use your tools that you have and practice those techniques. And working with this lovely intense color layer. And you can see here, just in real time, quickly, the difference between the wet watercolor and the dry, right? So we just applied this. Here it is wet, super bright and intense, and here it is light as it's drying. So that's why you want to build layer over layer, making sure that that last one is dry. Let's mop in, well, let's finish that. That texture is fun. So let's get that in while we're still there. I just love these kind of free painting processes where it's not so specific that we're caught up on the little details. I'm gonna blend that out just a little bit. Okay, and then let's go back into the body of the shell here as we did before. Mop in our color. You can see how each layer dries. You see peeking through the layer before it. One of the wonderful things about hand painting, seeing the painting reveal itself through each step. And we're getting really close. And let's get that alizarin crimson worked back in. That's really where the kind of fleshiness happens, and I can smooth the transition between these colors by mopping them in. And there's a little bit of a curved edge we can capture here just by varying the wash. And just going back in that same process, lifting, staining, let's lift some of this color out. Another thing, when you have a lot of water on your brush, is a glazing technique. So if you're wanting to, and we don't usually, I guess necessarily, refer to glazing much in watercolor, but if you're wanting to unify your colors that you've put down, it can help to do a broad glazing technique using just water, and it will just subtly blend everything together enough to bring some unity back to the piece. So if you're feeling like things have gotten a little too out of control for your own personal taste, you can always do a little bit of glazing with some clean water to help bring that home. Some of this pink fleshiness comes in here. It's a little bit of blushing. Okay. Now, as an added bonus, we can add some neutrals and whites if we want to. You can also leave areas white that you want to show as a highlight. Sometimes I like to use a little bit of white gouache just to crisp up the edges. You know, not everyone prefers to do it that way, but I love it. I love using a little bit of white paint to help bring out some of my best highlights. And I'm just going to take a little bit of white, but you can also use the other color that I have here is a buff white. So it's a sandy color and a little bit of white. And I'm just going to add a little bit of texture. It's very subtle, but it can go a long way, especially with a seashell. Why not use all of the colors available to you that you can? And this is optional, of course. You don't have to go this route. But I just love the texture, especially when you're painting something like a seashell. And that is available in the Utrecht brand, which is a great beginning watercolor or professional, wherever you are in your painting journey. Painting on the ridges there. Now let's just add a few final touches. We talked about how a little bit of an outline can help to bring some of that detail home. And we've just got this, too much water, just got this very subtle gray outline that we have here. And a very subtle alizarin outline that we have here. Now, because this is still wet, I'm going to bring our final piece in and show you some of the difference of what that's going to look like. And so depending on what kind of painter you are, if you're very heavy-handed or if you're extremely into detail, continue to let each layer dry and then paint over it to get some of that detail. And then eventually work your way to where you're comfortable with that painting being complete. I'm really happy with how I've been able to go back in layer over layer and add small detail lines and edges and crisp the outside of the seashell to make it really feel done. And so I hope that you have enjoyed this watercolor painting lesson, and I hope that you take these techniques on those road trips in your mind so that you can captivate some of the detail that you see out there. I hope you join us for our next demo, and I really enjoyed painting with you. We hope to see you again.